Hey, everybody. Nevin Gusak, your host of the Populist Patriot, doing another live stream here. And we're going to talk briefly about the some excerpts from the Buffalo Shooters Manifesto, which is very similar in certain ways to the manifesto issued by the racialist, national socialist type shooter that launched a bloody attack in Christchurch, New Zealand back in 2019. And the Buffalo shooter's name is Peyton Gendron, and he shot up and killed scores of our African American brethren, in Tops Market in Buffalo, New York. Now, the manifesto, it's hard to find, but I found some excerpts of it. And there are individuals that are saying they're focusing on the racial aspects, that clearly the guy's a racist, he's anti-Jewish, he's anti-African American, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people are trying to link in Tucker Carlson and other elements of the mainstream American right into Gendron's, the name of the Buffalo shooters, and his thinking. But really and truly, Gendron, I mean, he is a neo-Nazi by his own admission in the manifesto. He supports neo-Nazism, but he is not a member of neo-Nazi groups. Now, to claim that this guy is right-wing, I think it's more complicated than that. This guy is clearly a totalitarian. He's a murderer. He should get the death penalty, in my opinion. No question about it. For example, for all this talk that he, tying Tucker Carlson and other conservative hosts in here, the fact of the matter is that that he's not really a creature of the right. And I've written much about this, both in online essays as well as some books. And I created my Substack accounts today, so I will be writing long-form essays, papers, as well as newsletters and brief commentaries and reports on the news. So in his manifesto, he mentions, are you a conservative? Now, Tucker Carlson and Fox News and Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens and Turning Point USA and Michael Savage and others, these are conservatives of various stripes. So he asks, are you a conservative? And Gendron wrote, no, conservatism is corporatism. I think he meant corporatocracy, because corporatism is the economic policy of fascist dictatorships, where labor and capital cooperate with each other for the common good of the state and the nation. So I think he meant corporatocracy, which the United States is, and conservatism is a major enabler of corporatocracy. So he says, no, conservatism is corporatism in disguise. I want no part of it. Are you, quote, right-wing? Depending on the definition, sure. Are you left-wing? Depending on the definition, sure. So he's a hybrid of the right and the left, which immediately marks him as a national socialist, which reality is neither plain right nor plain left. Are you a socialist? Depending on the definition, worker ownership of the means of production, it depends on who those workers are, their intentions, who currently owns the means of production, their intentions, and who currently owns the state and their intentions. Very vague statement. He seems to think he is a socialist of some form, but he leaves much of this unanswered, but clearly is open to, quote, worker ownership of the means of production, as long as it's his people who think like him running the government and the economy, and what their long range plans are. If they're a form of socialism that Supports a multiracial coalition to take over the United States? Absolutely not. If it's a socialism that includes Jews in its leadership? Absolutely not. But if it's a form of socialism that's based on the participation as well as the betterment of white Aryans within the United States, then absolutely he supports it. That's my reading of his take on Gendron's take on socialism. Now this is a Q&A format. He asks the question and he answers it. Did you always hold these views? When I was 12, I was deep into communist ideology. Talk to anyone from my old high school and ask about me, and you will hear that. Very interesting. He started out as a communist. Now, is he a participant in communist organizations? He doesn't say. Like on a youth level, we don't know. From age 15 to 18, however, I consistently move farther to the right. On the political compass, I fall in the mild, moderate, authoritarian left category, and I would prefer to be called a populist. Now, let's make it very clear. Gendron's populism and the populism represented in this program, we have very profound differences. This gentleman wants a National Socialist totalitarian state. He kind of contradicts himself by saying he moved to the right, presumably not William F. Buckley Jr. or John Birch Society or Ron Paul Wright, presumably not. That he moved in a fascist or National Socialist position. And he calls himself mild, moderate, authoritarian left. And he takes it on the political compass test. And those political compass tests, depending on who's writing them, can be kind of tricky and have built-in biases. But it's very clear that he is not a creature ultimately of conservatism. He would not support radical civic nationalism because we are comparatively more politically and economically liberal compared to his views. And we also are very much for a multiracial coalition in our movement, in the worldview that I have. So I remember during the 1990s, during the Oklahoma City bombing, and the Clinton administration went on an absolute warpath, demonizing American conservatives, American right-wingers of all stripes, militia movements, so-called patriot movements and everything, and lumped them in with Timothy McVeigh. Now, when you look at Timothy McVeigh's article for the Lockport newspaper, Lockport is also in New York, he called for a blending of communism and capitalism in a hybrid ideology, in particularly areas like healthcare, for example. He definitely was understandably discontented with American political and economic structures, and he wrote this letter in 1992 when this country was really suffering. He really was on the country during 1992 was really suffering a near depression. People were very, very upset, but he was misrepresented as some sort of creature of the right. And Timothy McVeigh was clearly not. The neo-Nazi movement are not creatures of the right. They're a hybrid of both. So Tomas Viana wrote, no news. Oregon shooter also claimed being conservative. Then his Facebook profile showed being a Wicca fan. Apparently, the false flag mindset has already left secrecy walls and become mainstream. Well, that remains to be seen whether this is a false flag or not. Right here, it might be no news, but many people are still walking around thinking that this guy represents the political right, and that's not the case. Clearly, Uh, this gentleman, Peyton Gendron, is a representative of National Socialism, which is not left or right by contemporary standards. So, my solution to these issues, I mean, you're never going to stamp crime out completely, including this type of political extremism. But I think there are several ways we can ameliorate this situation, and that comes through populist economic and political reforms within the framework of the unifying principles of radical civic nationalism. And I think that's going to go a long way. Nick Hanauer, a multimillionaire, almost billionaire, and he's an economic reformer and a supporter of capitalism and hostile to socialism. He says that, even though you can't totally get rid of racism, the fact of the matter is when everybody is doing well and they don't really have the inclination to blame others if they were doing poorly. If everyone's doing well, that's going to be, quote, as he said, a hell of a distraction to neo-Nazi agitators. It will be a distraction where everybody's going to be just, having families and having good jobs and going on vacations and being patriotic. So that really, different racial agitators are not going to get very far with American people that are satisfied. So I think a long way goes. And I think the other issue is also we have to take mental health issues far more seriously in this country. And I know that personally from ex and current colleagues to a good friend of mine who committed suicide. So these are really some major issues that need to be dealt with. And that's the way you can really kind of cut down on these shooters and these shootings, because much of it is a result of despair and disturbed minds. And the only way we can start addressing these problems in a meaningful way is adopting the reforms inherent within radical civic nationalism. Thank you all. Thank you, Tomas, for listening. I appreciate that. And you all have a good night. I'm going to do another stream in a few moments.